My wife thought I didn't understand German when she whispered another man's hotel room time across a steakhouse table. I understood every word. I just smiled. That's the part people always ask me about first. How I didn't jump up. How I didn't throw my glass. How I didn't ask Elaine right there between the breadbasket and the $62 ribeye why she was making plans with Klaus Reinhardt at 1 in the morning. Truth is, I wanted to. My hand was wrapped around my water glass so tight my knuckles hurt. But I had spent 25 years married to Elaine Mercer, and one thing I'd learned was this. If Elaine thought she had the room under control, she got careless. So I let her. We were at Jeff Ruby's Steakhouse in downtown Cincinnati, the kind of place with low-lighting white tablecloths and servers who somehow made you feel underdressed even when you wore a blazer. Mine was navy blue, old, and a little tight across the shoulders. I'd bought it for a funeral 8 years earlier and told myself it still looked fine. Elaine looked like she belonged there. She always did. She wore a dark navy dress, simple pearl earrings, and her hair pinned low at the back of her neck. Not flashy, just expensive in a quiet way. She'd spent the car ride telling me not to bring up warehouse delays, diesel prices, or my bad knee. "Just keep it light, Frank," she said, checking her lipstick in the visor mirror. "Klaus is very important to the company." I kept both hands on the wheel of my 2013 Ford F-150 and said, "I know how to have dinner." She smiled without looking at me. "I know you do. I'm just saying this is business." That was Elaine's way of putting me in my place without raising her voice. I'd heard it for years. Business dinner. Business trip. Business call. Business decision. Somewhere along the way, our marriage had become something she scheduled around her real life. I was still useful, though. I fixed the leaky kitchen faucet. I picked up her dry cleaning when she was running late. I drove her mother to physical therapy after hip surgery, even though Margaret Blaine never once missed a chance to remind me her daughter had married beneath her potential. And that Friday night, Elaine needed me to sit beside her and look respectable. Family stability. That was the phrase she used. Mercer Blaine Medical Supply was a family company, and Klaus Reinhardt was supposedly the man who could help them expand into Europe. I worked logistics for another medical equipment outfit on the west side, so I understood enough about shipping inventory and hospital purchasing to know when people were using fancy words to dress up a gamble. But Elaine didn't bring me along for my opinion. She brought me because a wife with a steady husband looks safer to a board than a wife with a secret. Klaus stood when we arrived. He was tall silver at the temples, wearing a gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. His English was smooth with just enough accent to make people lean in. He took Elaine's hand with both of his. "Ellie," he said warmly. "Ellie." I'd been married to her for 25 years. I had never called her Ellie, not once. She hated nicknames, or at least I thought she did. Elaine laughed softly. "Klaus, this is Frank." He turned to me and offered his hand. His grip was firm, rehearsed. "Frank. At last. Elaine has told me so much about you." That sentence always sounds polite until you realize it can mean almost anything. "Good to meet you," I said. We sat down. Klaus ordered a bottle of Riesling before Elaine even opened the wine list. "She prefers something dry," he told the server. Elaine didn't correct him. That was the first little sting. Not the last. He knew she didn't eat scallops. He knew she hated cilantro. He knew she liked the corner booth because she didn't enjoy people walking behind her. All small things, harmless things, if you looked at each one by itself. But marriage teaches you the shape of familiarity. By the time the appetizers arrived, I could feel it sitting at the table with us. Klaus asked me a few polite questions about work. I answered plainly. When I mentioned supply chain delays around replacement imaging parts, Elaine jumped in. "What Frank means," she said, touching my sleeve, "is that the domestic side has been unpredictable." What Frank means. She'd been doing that more often lately, translating me into something she found acceptable. I looked at her hand on my sleeve. Her wedding ring caught the light. Mine felt heavy on my finger. Klaus smiled like he found us charming. You are lucky, he said to Elaine. A steady man at home is a great asset. Asset. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was too honest. The meal went on. Steaks came out sizzling. The server asked if everything was perfect. Elaine said it was. Klaus told a story about Munich, one of those polished business stories, where every detail makes the speaker look smart without sounding like bragging. Then my napkin slipped off my lap. I bent down to pick it up. That's when I saw his hand. Klaus reached under the edge of the table and brushed his fingers across the back of Elaine's hand. Not accidentally. Not like a man reaching for his fork. It was quick, practiced, and intimate, in a way that made my stomach go cold. Elaine didn't pull away. She leaned slightly toward him, and in German soft enough that she thought I couldn't follow, she said, "Heute Nacht. Das alte Zimmer. 1 Uhr. Tonight. The old room, 1 o'clock." My fingers closed around the napkin. Klaus answered in German. Is he completely clueless? Elaine gave a tiny smile. He barely understands his phone settings. I sat back up. There are moments when your body learns something before your mind catches up. My ears got hot. My chest tightened. The room seemed to shrink until all I could see was Elaine's calm face, Klaus's satisfied smile, and that untouched piece of asparagus on my plate. I had lived in Stuttgart in 1991. Army logistics, nothing glamorous. Mostly warehouses, manifests, and cold mornings that smelled like diesel and wet concrete. I wasn't fluent, not the way people brag about being fluent. But I knew enough German to rent an apartment, argue with a mechanic ordered dinner, and understand when my wife was arranging to meet another man in an old hotel room at 1 in the morning. Elaine knew I had been stationed there. She just never believed it mattered. For years, she joked Frank only learned how to order beer and say thank you. I let her think that. That night, it saved me from giving myself away. I picked up my knife and cut my steak into a smaller piece than I needed to. My hand was still steady, and I was proud of that in a sad kind of way. "So Klaus," I said, "how long are you in town?" Elaine glanced at me, probably checking whether I had noticed anything. Klaus dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "Only through the weekend. Much to do, unfortunately." "I bet," I said. Elaine's eyes narrowed just a touch, but I kept my face easy. I had spent half my life being underestimated by that woman, maybe longer. In the beginning, I thought she saw something in me other people missed. Later, I understood she liked that I didn't compete with her. I was safe, reliable, the man in the background. I helped pay for her MBA by selling my old Harley. I worked night shifts so she could take evening classes. I learned which brand of soup her mother liked after surgery. I sat through company Christmas parties where people asked if I was still doing warehouse work like I'd failed some test I never signed up for. And I did most of it gladly. That's the thing people don't understand. Love can make ordinary sacrifice feel like purpose, until the person you sacrifice for starts treating your kindness like proof you're small. Elaine excused herself to the restroom after dessert. Klaus stayed seated, checked his phone, then took a call. He turned slightly away from me, but not enough. "No," he said in English, quieter now. "The board doesn't know yet." I stared down at my coffee. "Yes, Elaine says the transfer will clear after approval." The word transfer landed harder than the German had. I knew Mercer Blaine was preparing some kind of expansion deal. Elaine had talked around it for months without ever giving me details. She said it was above my lane. Her phrase, not mine. Above my lane. Klaus ended the call and gave me a pleasant smile. "Business never sleeps," he said. "No," I said. "I guess it doesn't." Elaine came back smelling faintly of perfume and powder. She laid her hand on Klaus's shoulder as she passed behind him. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but I saw it. I saw all of it. On the drive home, the Ohio River looked black under the bridges, and downtown Cincinnati faded behind us in the rearview mirror. Elaine sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, calm as church on Sunday morning. "You were quiet tonight," she said. "Long day." She smiled at the screen. You always were easy to read. I kept driving. At home, she kissed my cheek like nothing had happened and went upstairs. I heard the bathroom faucet, the closet door, the soft thump of her shoes hitting the floor. Normal sounds, married sounds, the kind that can fool you into thinking your life is still intact. I stayed downstairs. The kitchen was dark except for the little light over the stove. I made coffee I didn't want and sat at the table with my old laptop. The house smelled like Folgers and winter air coming in around the back door. For a while, I didn't touch the keyboard. I just looked at my wedding ring. Then I opened my email and searched the company name, the hotel name, and Klaus Reinhardt. 3 years back, Mercer Blaine had held its 40th anniversary event at the Phelps Hotel downtown. I found the photo album Elaine had forwarded me and clicked through the pictures. There he was, Klaus, standing behind Elaine near the ballroom entrance, his hand resting on the back of her chair, like he already belonged there. So tonight wasn't their first meeting. It was just the first time she'd been careless enough to bring me along. I sat there until the coffee went cold, listening to the furnace kick on and off. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched for a name I hadn't needed in years. Daniel Price, attorney at law. This time, I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to beg. And I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't understood. I didn't call Daniel right away. That may sound strange considering what I had just heard. But at 53, you learn there's a difference between urgency and panic. Panic makes you loud. Urgency makes you careful. And I needed to be careful. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and Elaine moving around upstairs like any other Friday night. Drawer sliding open, closet door closing, water running in the sink. Ordinary little sounds that suddenly felt like evidence from someone else's life. I sat at our kitchen table with that old laptop in front of me, the kind that took its sweet time opening a browser tab. Elaine used to tease me about it. Frank, that thing belongs in a museum. Maybe it did. But that night, it gave me what I needed. I went through every old email I could find from Mercer Blaine Medical Supply, holiday party invitations, board dinner reminders, charity golf outing schedules. Then I searched the Phelps Hotel. There it was. 3 years earlier, Mercer Blaine had held its 40th anniversary celebration there. I remembered the night vaguely. Elaine wore a silver dress. Her mother, Margaret Blaine, gave a speech that somehow thanked everyone except me, even though I'd spent that afternoon helping load display stands into a rented van because their event company had messed up the delivery time. That was Margaret's style. Useful when needed, invisible once the room filled up. I opened the photo album Elaine had forwarded after the event. Dozens of pictures loaded slowly. People holding champagne flutes. Elaine beside donors. Margaret looking stern near a cake with the company logo on it. Victor Hale shaking hands with some hospital administrator. And then I found Klaus. He was in the background of a photo near the ballroom entrance, standing behind Elaine with that same polished smile. Not front and center, not introduced, just close enough to matter. I leaned closer to the screen. His hand was resting on the back of Elaine's chair. Not touching her exactly, but familiar. Comfortable. I clicked to the next picture. There he was, again half-turned toward her, while everyone else faced the camera. I sat back and rubbed my face. So Elaine had lied at dinner. Klaus wasn't some new business partner she was introducing to me. He was someone from the past, someone tied to that hotel, maybe tied to that old room. The thought made my stomach turn. For 10 minutes, I did nothing. Just sat there with one hand over my mouth, staring at the screen while the coffee went cold beside me. Then I called Daniel Price. It was close to 11:40 p.m., and I expected voicemail. Instead, he answered on the fourth ring, voice rough with sleep. Frank, somebody dead. Not yet, I said. There was a pause. Well, he said that's either a joke or a warning. Which one? I tried to laugh, but it came out flat. I need advice. He listened while I told him about the dinner, the German, the hotel, the 1 o'clock meeting. I didn't dress it up. I didn't add drama. I just laid out what happened as plainly as I could. Daniel had been my lawyer years earlier after a workplace injury dispute, but he was also the kind of man people kept in their phone because he knew how to stay calm while everybody else was sweating through their shirts. When I finished, he didn't say what I wanted him to say. He didn't say go catch them. He didn't say make her explain. He said, Frank, listen to me carefully. Do not confront her tonight. I gripped the phone. Daniel, she's meeting him at 1 in the morning. I heard you. At a hotel. I heard that too. So what am I supposed to do, sit here and drink coffee? No, he said. You document what you can legally document. Public spaces. Times. Photos if you're in a public area. Texts. Receipts. But you don't threaten her. You don't break into anything, you don't touch that man. And you don't turn your pain into evidence against yourself. That last part landed hard. I looked toward the ceiling, toward the room where Elaine was probably sleeping like a baby. Daniel softened his voice. A man can lose everything by being right in the wrong way. I hated how sensible that sounded. So I just let her go. You let the truth show itself, he said. Then you call me at 7. After we hung up, I sat there another few minutes. I told myself I would stay home. I told myself Daniel was right. I told myself I was too old to be skulking around hotel lobbies after midnight, like some fool in a detective movie. Then I put on my coat. I'm not proud of that. But I won't lie about it either. By 12:35 a.m., I was driving toward downtown Cincinnati in my old F-150. The heater blew warm air on my knees, the radio was off, and every red light felt personal. I kept hearing Elaine's voice in my head. He barely understands his phone settings. It wasn't even the affair that kept replaying. It was the laugh under it. The assumption. The way she had reduced me to a harmless man sitting at the table with his steak and his cheap blazer, too slow to understand he was being humiliated. I parked 2 blocks from the Phelps Hotel and sat in the truck with both hands on the wheel. The city was quieter at that hour. Wet pavement streetlights, a few people coming out of bars with their collars pulled up against the cold. I almost drove home. I really did. My father used to say, never make a permanent decision while your hands are shaking. He said it after I came back from the army and nearly took a swing at a guy in a bar who called me a warehouse grunt. He wasn't a soft man, my father, but he understood self-respect better than most. So I sat there until my breathing slowed. Then I walked into the hotel. The lobby was warm and smelled like polished wood lemon cleaner and expensive soap. A young woman at the front desk looked up with that professional smile people use when they're not sure whether you're a guest or a problem. I tried to look casual. Instead, I dropped my keys on the marble floor. They hit loud enough to echo. The desk clerk blinked. Sir, are you okay? I picked them up and said, I'm 53 wearing dress shoes after midnight and about to pay $8 for sparkling water. So, no, probably not. She laughed before she could stop herself. That helped strangely. I went to the lobby bar and ordered a club soda. I sat where I could see the elevators without looking like I was watching them. At least I hoped so. I probably looked like a man waiting for bad news because that's what I was. At 12:58, Klaus Reinhardt walked in. No gray suit this time. Black coat. Open collar. Same smooth face. He glanced around once, not nervous, just checking the room like a man used to not being challenged. He went near the elevators and looked at his phone. At 1:02, Elaine came through the revolving door. She wore a dark coat, her hair down now, and she was not wearing her wedding ring. That detail hit me harder than I expected. A ring is small, barely any weight at all. But seeing her hand without it felt like watching her erase 25 years in one quiet motion. Klaus touched her lower back when she reached him. She didn't move away. I took one photo. Just one. They were in the public lobby. Nothing private, nothing dramatic. Just Elaine and Klaus standing close before the elevators at the Phelps Hotel at 1 o'clock in the morning, exactly where she had said they would be. At 1:05 a.m., I sent it to Daniel. They're here. The Phelps. Same hotel from the old company event. His reply came quicker than I expected. Do not confront. Go home. Call me at 7. I stared at the message until the words blurred a little. Then I stood up. Every part of me wanted to walk to those elevators, to say her name, to watch her face change when she realized I knew. There's a particular hunger that comes with being humiliated. You want the person who did it to feel exposed right then, that second in front of somebody. But Daniel was right. If I wanted truth, I had to stop feeding my anger. So I walked out. As I reached the revolving door, I saw someone step out from the side hallway near the event rooms. Marcy Delgado. I knew Marcy from company Christmas parties and summer cookouts. She was 62, maybe 63, with short dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of sensible shoes worn by women who actually kept offices running. She carried a stack of folders against her chest and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She saw me. Then she looked past me toward the elevators. Whatever color she had in her face drained out. Marcy, I said quietly. She shook her head once. Not no exactly. More like not here. Then she walked past me and out into the cold. I followed her as far as the sidewalk, but she was already moving fast toward the parking garage, her coat pulled tight around her. She didn't look back. I stood there under the hotel awning, watching my breath turn white in the air. That was when I knew this wasn't just my imagination. And maybe it wasn't just my marriage either. I drove home without turning on the radio. Elaine's side of the bed was empty when I got there. I didn't go upstairs. I sat in the garage with the truck engine off and the cold slowly creeping in around me. A neighbor from 2 houses down walked by with his old Beagle. He peered into the garage. You all right, Frank? I looked at him through the windshield. Working on it. He nodded like that was a complete answer. Men our age do that sometimes. We know when not to ask too much. I finally went inside around 2. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the recliner with my coat still on, listening for Elaine's car. She came home at 3:38 a.m. I heard the garage door, her footsteps, the careful pause in the hallway. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. She stood near the living room entrance for several seconds. I could feel her looking at me. Then she went upstairs, no guilt in her voice, no apology, no sound except the soft creak of the steps. At 6:48 a.m., my phone buzzed on the side table. A text from a number I didn't have saved, but I knew who it was the moment I read it. Frank, this is Marcy Delgado. Can you meet me before work? Please. This isn't just about your marriage. I sat up slowly. The house was dim and gray with morning. Upstairs, my wife was sleeping. And for the first time all night, I was more afraid of what I might find than of what I already knew. I met Marcy Delgado at a Waffle House across the river in Covington at 7:15 the next morning. The place smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, and syrup soaked into old wood. A waitress with tired eyes called everybody hon, and somewhere behind the counter a cook was arguing with someone about college basketball. It was the most ordinary place in the world, which made the envelope Marcy slid across the table feel even worse. She looked exhausted. Same gray sweater from the night before, hair pinned back too quickly, no makeup, except whatever had survived a long night. You came, she said quietly. You sounded scared. I am. The waitress set down my coffee. I wrapped both hands around the mug even though it was too hot. Marcy looked around before speaking again. Not dramatic, just cautious. The way people look around before discussing layoffs or medical results. I almost kept driving last night, she said, when I saw you at the hotel. I nodded once. I almost walked to the elevators. That got the smallest hint of a smile from her. Well, she said, then both of us made one good decision. I opened the manila envelope. Inside were printed emails, spreadsheets, and what looked like copies of internal authorization forms from Mercer Blaine Medical Supply. Numbers circled in blue ink, notes in the margins. I looked up at her. Marcy, I don't understand half of this. You don't need to understand all of it. Just enough. She pointed to one page. That's Rhinemark Holdings. The German company. Supposed German company, she corrected. I looked closer. The document showed a consulting advance of $1.8 million tied to a European expansion proposal. That's real money, I said. Marcy gave a dry laugh. At Mercer Blaine. That's Tuesday morning money. Then her face tightened again. But this isn't approved money. She handed me another page. These are access logs for Margaret Blaine's digital signature file. I stared at the timestamps. One entry jumped out immediately. Thursday night, 11:42 p.m. Just hours before the dinner at Jeff Ruby's. Marcy lowered her voice. Frank, if this was only cheating, I wouldn't have called you. I looked up slowly. She's risking the whole company. That sentence sat between us harder than anything else she'd said. Because until that moment, part of me still wanted this to be small. Painful? Yes. Humiliating, absolutely. But small enough to keep inside a marriage. An affair is personal, ugly, but personal. Fraud changes everything. I leaned back in the booth and rubbed my jaw. Outside the windows, the Ohio morning looked flat and gray. Cars hissed past on wet pavement. A delivery truck backed into the alley behind the restaurant with that long beeping sound that always reminds me of warehouse loading docks. I suddenly thought about all the people working at Mercer Blaine that morning. Drivers, inventory clerks, billing staff, warehouse guys with bad knees and coffee breath showing up before sunrise because hospitals still needed supplies, whether executives cheated on each other or not. I knew people like that. Hell, I was people like that. Marcy folded her hands together tightly. I worked for Howard Blaine for 28 years, she said. Your father-in-law was difficult. Everybody knew that. But he didn't play games with payroll. He didn't gamble the company. I had never heard anyone call Howard Blaine your father-in-law before. Usually people just said Mr. Blaine even after he died. Does Margaret know? I asked. No, at least not everything. Elaine would really do this to her own mother. Marcy looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep. I think Elaine spent so many years trying to prove she could run that company alone, she stopped caring how she got there. The waitress came by to refill our coffee. You folks need anything else? Marcy shook her head quickly. I asked for toast, even though I wasn't hungry. Sometimes ordering food makes people look less suspicious when they're having terrible conversations in public. After the waitress walked away, I picked up one of the emails. It was between Elaine and Klaus. Most of it was business language I barely understood, but one line near the bottom stood out. Margaret cannot delay this again. Once the transfer clears, the board won't be able to reverse course without serious exposure. My chest tightened. I looked at Marcy. You think Klaus is using her? I think they're using each other. That felt closer to the truth. I stared down at the papers. 25 years. That number kept moving through my head like a slow train. 25 years of birthdays, mortgage payments, doctor, visits, arguments over paint colors, long drives to visit her mother at Christmas, replacing washing machines, sitting beside her, in hospital waiting rooms after Margaret's surgery, listening to her complain about board politics while I reheated leftovers at midnight. And somewhere during all of that, my wife became someone who whispered hotel plans in German while arranging questionable money transfers behind her mother's back. Or maybe she had always been capable of it, and I just never wanted to see it. That possibility hurt more. Marcy touched the envelope. There's more. I looked up. I copied everything I safely could. You could lose your job for this. I could lose it anyway if this deal goes bad. Fair point. She took a breath. Frank, Elaine's been different the last year. How? She started treating people like obstacles. Small lies at first, then bigger ones. She stopped asking for approval and started assuming she deserved it. That sounded painfully familiar. At home, Elaine had done the same thing in quieter ways. She stopped discussing decisions, started informing me of them. I suddenly remembered the kitchen remodel from 2 years earlier. She hired contractors without telling me, because in her words, you would have slowed the process down. At the time I told myself it was just stress. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked back at the signature logs. Why show me this? Because she still thinks you're harmless. That word again. Harmless. I almost smiled at the irony. People hear harmless and think weak, but most harmless men are just men who spent years choosing peace over pride. Eventually, some of them stop choosing. I checked the time on my phone. 7:38 a.m. Marcy noticed. You should call Margaret now before Elaine gets to the office. I exhaled slowly. Calling Margaret Blaine was never something anybody wanted to do before breakfast. She answered on the third ring. This better not be about Elaine embarrassing you at dinner, she said immediately. Even then, even with everything else happening, her first assumption was that her daughter had simply been rude to me. I looked out the Waffle House window. No, I said quietly. I wish it was that small. Silence. Not long. Just enough for her to realize something in my voice had changed. What happened? I told her carefully. The German. The hotel. The documents Marcy brought me. The transfer. Margaret interrupted only once. At 1 in the morning. Yes. Another silence. Then I texted her the photo from the Phelps Hotel. The 3 little dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally she spoke. Where are you? Waffle House. Covington side. Stay there. Her voice sounded different now, older somehow. I'm calling Victor. Victor Hale was chairman of the board, and one of those men who looked permanently disappointed by modern life. I'd met him twice at company events. He shook hands like he was signing contracts. Margaret continued. There will be an emergency board meeting at 9. Margaret. No, she said sharply. You listen to me now. You will not confront Elaine before then. Do you understand? I looked at Marcy. I understand. Good. Then quieter. And Frank. Thank you for calling me before this became impossible to stop. She hung up. Marcy stared at her coffee. Well, she muttered that went better than expected. I actually laughed a little at that. Not because anything was funny, but because tension has to go somewhere eventually. The waitress brought my toast. I took one bite and immediately realized my stomach wanted no part of food. By 8:20, I was driving home to change clothes before heading toward Mercer Blaine. The closer I got to the house, the harder my chest felt. Part of me still wanted to walk inside and hear some explanation that made all of this less real. Not innocent, just smaller. But when I stepped into the kitchen, Elaine was standing by the counter, calmly making coffee from one of those expensive pods she liked. She looked rested. Beautiful, honestly. That was the worst part. Betrayal would be easier if ugly people did it. You were out early, she said. Couldn't sleep. She slid a mug toward me without asking if I wanted one. Long night. I looked at her bare left hand wrapped around the coffee cup. The wedding ring was back on. Like the missing hours had never happened. Something like that. Elaine studied me for a second. You look terrible, Frank. There wasn't cruelty in her tone. That's what made it sting. She said it casually, the way someone comments on rain. Because in her mind, she was still in control of the room. Still smarter, still untouchable. Still married to the harmless man who wouldn't understand what he'd heard in German. She picked up her purse. I have a board meeting this morning. Probably going to be a long day. I nodded once. I bet. Then she walked out the door. At 9 a.m., my wife entered the Mercer Blaine boardroom, wearing a cream-colored blazer and a confident smile. She had no idea her mother, the company lawyers, and the chairman of the board had already seen the photo I sent at 1:05 that morning. And for the first time in a very long while, Elaine Mercer was the one walking into a room, unprepared. I wasn't inside the boardroom when the meeting started. That bothered me more than I expected. You spend 25 years standing beside someone helping build the life they claim they earned alone. And then, the biggest moment of your marriage happens behind a frosted glass door you're not allowed to open. Daniel insisted it stay that way. This is corporate counsel territory. Now, he told me over the phone that morning, "You are not helping anybody by storming into that room." So I sat in my truck in the Mercer Blaine parking lot, like a man waiting outside an operating room. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Beige brick, company sign out front. Delivery vans lined up near the loading dock. Employees carrying travel mugs through the side entrance while checking their phones. Ordinary Monday morning energy, which felt almost insulting. My whole life had cracked open overnight, and the world still wanted inventory reports and coffee refills. I parked beneath a bare maple tree near the far edge of the lot. Rainwater dripped from the branches onto the hood of the truck in uneven little taps. At 9:03, my phone buzzed. Daniel. She's presenting the expansion proposal now. That was it. No drama, no details, just updates short and controlled. I leaned back in the seat and looked toward the second-floor windows where the boardroom sat. I could picture it perfectly. Long walnut table, cheap framed photos of hospital ribbon cuttings, Keurig machine in the corner beside stale Panera bagels, Margaret sitting stiff-backed near the far end, Victor Hale with his reading glasses low on his nose, and Elaine at the front of the room, confident, prepared, certain she could talk her way through anything. That confidence used to impress me. When we were younger, I loved watching her command a room. She could walk into a fundraiser or vendor meeting and make people feel like they'd known her for years. Back then, I thought her ambition was courage. Maybe part of it was. But ambition changes shape when nobody tells you no anymore. At 9:11, another text came through from Daniel. Klaus on Zoom, Margaret silent so far. I rubbed my jaw. My stomach felt hollow. I realized I hadn't eaten anything except half a piece of toast since the night before. A warehouse truck backed into the loading dock nearby with a long beeping sound. 2 employees in Mercer Blaine jackets unloaded boxes while laughing about football. I watched them for a while. People like that always mattered more to me than board members did. Maybe because I understood them. Guys with mortgages and knee braces and daughters in community college. Men who measured a good week by whether overtime covered the electric bill. I kept thinking about what Marcy said. She's risking the whole company. At 9:17, my phone rang. Not Daniel this time. Elaine. I stared at her name lighting up the dashboard. I let it ring out. 30 seconds later, another call. Then a text. Pick up. I locked the screen without answering. A minute later. What did you do? That one sat heavier. Because buried under the anger was fear. Good, I thought. Then I hated myself a little for thinking it. Daniel texted again. Victor asked whether Margaret personally approved the transfer. Elaine said yes. I exhaled slowly. That meant she was still committing to the lie. The rain started coming down harder, streaking the windshield in crooked lines. Another text from Elaine appeared. Frank, now. For years that tone would have worked on me. Not because I was weak, because marriage trains you into patterns. Keep the peace. Avoid escalation. Smooth things over. I used to think that was maturity. Sometimes it's just surrender with better manners. At 9:26, Daniel finally called. I answered immediately. What's happening? She just opened the authorization file. And Daniel paused. Margaret spoke up. I tightened my grip on the phone. What did she say? She said, "That's a beautiful signature." Despite everything, I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Margaret. What did Elaine do? She said, "It's yours." And Margaret. Daniel's voice lowered slightly. She told the room she hasn't signed her full legal signature that way since her husband died. I closed my eyes. There it was. The crack. Not loud, not explosive, but enough. I pictured Elaine standing at the front of that room, with all those eyes suddenly looking at her differently. Not admiring. Evaluating. That's the thing about powerful people. Their confidence survives almost anything except silence from the room. Once people stop automatically agreeing with them, panic creeps in fast. Daniel continued. Marcy's in there now. My head snapped up. She agreed to testify. She brought the access logs herself. I looked toward the building again. Poor Marcy. I knew what it cost her to walk into that room. People imagine courage as dramatic speeches and slammed fists. Most real courage looks like a tired woman carrying printed documents into a meeting where richer people will try to make her feel small. My phone buzzed again. Elaine. Then another text. You had no right. I laughed under my breath. No right. 25 years of paying mortgages, covering dinners, with Margaret, repairing gutters, sitting beside hospital beds, helping hold together the ordinary parts of a life. And suddenly, I had no right to react when my wife lied to my face and possibly committed fraud. That laugh faded quickly, because underneath my anger was grief. Real grief. I still loved parts of her. That was the ugly truth nobody talks about in stories like this. Betrayal doesn't erase love cleanly. It just poisons it. Daniel interrupted my thoughts. Frank. Yeah. She just tried to discredit Marcy. How? She implied memory problems. I shut my eyes again. Of course she did. When Elaine felt cornered, she attacked competence first. I'd seen it happen at home in smaller ways. A contractor disagreed with her once during the kitchen remodel, and afterward, she told everybody he seemed a little confused. A neighbor corrected her about HOA rules, and suddenly that neighbor was unstable. Elaine didn't scream when threatened. She reduced people. What did Victor say, I asked. He told her to be careful. Good. That meant Victor smelled blood in the water now. Daniel's voice shifted. Hold on. I heard muffled movement in the background, a chair scraping. Somebody speaking too far from the phone to make out. Then Daniel came back. You're not going to believe this. What? She accidentally showed one of Klaus's emails while switching screens. A cold feeling moved through me. What email? Daniel read slowly. You promised the husband was harmless. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel laughed once under his breath. What? Bob Atkinson, he said. He just sat up and said, well, that's not in the agenda. Despite myself, I barked out a laugh. A real one this time. Not because any of this was funny, because tension does strange things to the body, and Bob Atkinson apparently chose that exact moment to wake up from his usual boardroom nap. My laughter disappeared almost immediately, because now it was real. No more suspicion. No more, maybe. Elaine knew it too. The call started again instantly. 3 in less than 2 minutes. I ignored all of them. At 9:41, Daniel texted, Board requested Elaine leave the room during closed discussion. I stared at the message. For the first time since the steakhouse, I pictured her not as my wife, but as a person suddenly realizing the floor beneath her wasn't solid anymore. That thought should have satisfied me more than it did. Instead, I mostly felt tired. 10 minutes later, the boardroom doors upstairs opened. Employees in the parking lot pretended not to notice, but everybody noticed. Elaine walked out fast, not panicked. She was too disciplined for that. But furious in the controlled way wealthy people get furious, tight shoulders, clipped steps, face held still because emotion itself feels beneath them. She spotted my truck immediately. Of course she did. She marched across the parking lot through the rain and slammed her hand against my window. I lowered it halfway. For a second, we just stared at each other. She looked beautiful and exhausted and dangerous all at once. You stupid, stupid man, she said quietly. You have no idea what you just cost me. I studied her face carefully. No apology. Not one. No, how could you think that? No denial about the hotel. Nothing except anger that the room had turned against her. And suddenly something inside me settled. Not healed. Just settled. Because for the first time in 25 years, I stopped waiting for Elaine Mercer to become someone she wasn't. I looked at her through the rain sliding down the glass. "No," I said calmly. "I think I finally do." She stared at me another second like she wanted to say something cruel enough to cut bone. Instead, she stepped back. And for the first time since I met her, Elaine Mercer looked uncertain. Not defeated. Just no longer sure the world would move the way she expected. She turned and walked back toward the building without another word. I sat there gripping the steering wheel long after she disappeared inside. Rain hammered softly against the roof of the truck. And somewhere deep down beneath the anger and humiliation and exhaustion, another feeling finally started pushing its way through. Relief. Because the truth was out now. And truth once spoken aloud doesn't go quietly back into hiding. By the time I got home that evening, the house felt unfamiliar. Same driveway, same brick front porch, same crooked porch light I kept meaning to replace. But the silence inside had changed. You can tell when a house has stopped being a home before anybody officially says it out loud. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and stood there, listening. The refrigerator hummed. The heating vents rattled softly. Somewhere upstairs, water pipes clicked. No television. No music. Just tension sitting in every room like cigarette smoke. I loosened my tie and walked into the living room. Our wedding picture still hung above the fireplace. Elaine in ivory satin. Me looking stunned anybody that beautiful wanted to marry me. I stood there longer than I should have. Then I sat down in my recliner, the old brown leather one Elaine hated, because it made the room look middle class, and rubbed both hands over my face. On the coffee table sat the mug she bought me years earlier as a joke. World's okayest husband. Back then we laughed about it. Now it looked cruel. I picked it up, turned it slowly in my hands, then set it back down. That's the strange thing about betrayal. It rewrites old memories while you're still standing inside them. Suddenly every joke sounds different. Every silence means more than it used to. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. 25 years. I kept circling that number all day like my mind couldn't quite process it. 25 years of helping build a life with someone who eventually looked at me and saw background furniture. Not evil, not dangerous, harmless. The front door opened around 7:40. Elaine walked in carrying her purse and laptop bag. She looked tired now. The kind of tired, expensive makeup can't fully cover. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she placed her bag carefully on the kitchen counter and said, "So this is really happening." I stayed seated. "You tell me." Her jaw tightened. "You embarrassed me in front of the board." That sentence told me everything. Not you hurt me. Not you invaded my privacy. Not even you misunderstood something. You embarrassed me. I nodded slowly. I wasn't the one at the hotel. She looked away first. That surprised me. Elaine usually held eye contact like a weapon. "I told you," she said carefully. "You don't understand what was going on. Then explain it." "It wasn't what you think." I almost laughed. Not because I didn't believe her. Because after 25 years together, she still thought vague sentences could pull me back into line. She walked into the living room and stayed standing, arms crossed tightly. Klaus and I were discussing business privately. At 1 in the morning. Yes. In a hotel room. In a hotel. I looked at her. "Elaine, don't insult both of us." Her nostrils flared slightly. "There are things happening with the company you wouldn't understand." There it was again. That same quiet arrogance. Not loud enough to sound cruel to outsiders, just enough to remind me where she believed I ranked. A younger version of me would have backed down right there. I know that now. I would have apologized for my tone, tried to calm her down, suggested counseling before even getting answers. But something had shifted overnight. Not rage. Clarity. I stood up slowly from the recliner. "You know the strange thing I said. I spent years thinking your biggest problem was ambition." Elaine said nothing. "It wasn't," I continued. "It was contempt." That hit her harder than yelling would have. I could tell. She looked away toward the kitchen. For a few seconds, all we heard was the heater clicking on. Then she changed tactics completely. Her shoulders dropped, her voice softened. "Frank, we've been through hard times before." There she was. The Elaine I fell in love with. Or the version she knew worked best on me. "I know things look bad right now," she said quietly. "But none of this had to become public." Public. Again, not wrong. Not betrayal. Public. She stepped closer. "Klaus pushed too hard on the expansion deal. I should have handled it differently. But the board was never going to listen to me unless I delivered results. And the hotel." She hesitated. "Not long. Just enough. We got too close." There it was. Not an apology. More like a business correction. Acknowledge the minimum necessary damage and move on. I stared at her face, searching for something genuine underneath the performance. Maybe there was some. That's the hard part. People are rarely all one thing. I believe Elaine loved me once. I really do. I think somewhere along the line she started measuring people by usefulness instead of loyalty. And once that happens, affection turns into management. She sat down on the edge of the couch across from me. "You think my mother cares about you?" she asked quietly. "You're useful to her tonight. That's all." I almost answered defensively out of habit. Then I realized what she was doing. Trying to isolate me. Trying to pull me back into the old pattern where she defined reality, and I adjusted myself around it. I shook my head slowly. "You still don't get it." Her expression hardened again. "Then explain it to me, Frank." So I did. In German. Ich habe jedes Wort verstanden. I understood every word. Elaine froze. Not dramatically, no movie-style gasp, just absolute stillness. The color drained from her face inch by inch. For the first time since this started, she looked genuinely unprepared. I held her eyes. "Stuttgart," I said quietly. 1991. "Remember." She stared at me another long second. "You knew?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since the steakhouse." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. I could practically see the last 24 hours rearranging themselves in her head. Every confident move she made depended on one assumption, that I was too slow, too simple, too harmless to understand what was happening. And suddenly that foundation disappeared. "You let me walk into that board meeting," she whispered. I nodded once. "You called me clueless." Silence stretched between us. Then her phone started vibrating on the coffee table. "Klaus." She grabbed it immediately. "Hello?" Nothing. "Klaus." She stood up and walked toward the kitchen, voice sharper now. "What do you mean, flagged?" I looked down at my wedding ring. Elaine listened another few seconds before hanging up hard. Her face had changed. Fear now. Real fear. "What happened?" I asked. She looked at me but didn't answer. My phone rang. Daniel. I stepped into the hallway to answer. "They stopped Reinhardt at the airport," Daniel said. "Arrested?" "No. But federal authorities flagged financial irregularities tied to one of his European holding companies. Corporate counsel forwarded information this afternoon." I leaned against the wall. "So he's done." "He's scared," Daniel corrected. "There's a difference." That sounded accurate. Men like Klaus rarely disappeared because of morality. They disappeared because risk stopped being profitable. When I walked back into the kitchen, Elaine was pacing. "He said this is temporary," she muttered. I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. Because for the first time, she was realizing Klaus Reinhardt never planned to burn with her if things went bad. He planned to leave. Just like men like him always do. Elaine stopped pacing and looked at me with sudden anger, again, like fear needed somewhere to go. "You think you built any of this?" she snapped. "You worked warehouses and loading docks while I carried this family." That one landed deep. Because part of me always feared she believed it. Maybe part of me feared it was true. I looked around the kitchen. At the cabinets I installed myself one summer, because we couldn't afford contractors yet. At the old clock I repaired twice instead of replacing, because Elaine said the original matched the house better. At the table where I paid bills while she traveled for conferences. No, I said quietly. I didn't build your company. She folded her arms. Exactly. But I know the difference between building something and burning it down. Her eyes flickered. Not because the line was clever. Because she knew I meant it. We stood there in silence a while longer. Finally, I walked to the kitchen drawer, pulled out the envelope Daniel had prepared, and placed it gently on the table. Elaine looked down at it. What's that? Temporary separation paperwork. Asset protection recommendations, too. You already talked to a divorce lawyer. I talked to my lawyer. She stared at the envelope like it had physically insulted her. You're really doing this. I thought carefully before answering. Because despite everything, I didn't want to lie. No, I said softly. You did this. I'm just finally signing my name to it. Her eyes watered slightly. Then, though I couldn't tell whether it was sadness, exhaustion, or humiliation, maybe all three. The next morning, I got dressed in the quietest house I'd ever lived in. Gray suit, blue tie, same wedding ring still on my finger. Elaine stood in the kitchen holding a coffee cup when I came downstairs. Neither of us spoke. I walked to the sink, slid the ring off slowly, and placed it on the counter beside her. The sound it made against the granite was very small, but after 25 years it sounded loud enough to echo. Elaine stared at it without moving. I picked up my keys. Before walking out the door, I looked at her one last time. You wanted the old room at 1, I said quietly. Then I opened the door. You got a boardroom at 9. The final board meeting started at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. That felt appropriate somehow. Lives fall apart in dramatic ways on television. In real life, they usually fall apart on schedule. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat alone in the Mercer Blaine lobby, while employees pretended not to stare at me. The receptionist offered coffee twice. I said no both times. My stomach had been tight for 2 straight days. Outside late February, rain streaked the windows in thin gray lines. Delivery vans rolled in and out of the loading area, like nothing unusual was happening upstairs. Business keeps moving. That's one of the crueler truths of adulthood. The world rarely pauses long enough for your heartbreak to catch its breath. Daniel arrived carrying a leather folder under one arm. Same calm expression. Same loosened tie. How'd you sleep, he asked. I didn't. That's normal. You always this comforting. He gave half a smile. I charge extra for comforting. That got a tired laugh out of me. Then the elevator doors opened. Elaine stepped out. Cream-colored blazer again. Hair pulled back neatly. Makeup perfect. If someone walked past her in the hallway, they'd think she was heading into a quarterly earnings presentation. Not the collapse of her marriage and career. She saw me immediately. For 1 second, something flickered across her face. Hurt, maybe. Anger. Exhaustion. Then it disappeared behind professionalism. That was always Elaine's talent. Compartmentalizing. She walked past us without speaking and disappeared into the boardroom. Daniel looked at me. You ready? Number. But I nodded anyway. The boardroom smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. Margaret Blaine sat near the end of the long walnut table, wearing a dark green jacket and reading glasses low on her nose. Victor Hale sat beside company counsel, flipping through documents. Marcy Delgado was already there too, hands folded tightly in her lap. When she saw me, she gave the smallest nervous smile. I returned it. That woman had more courage than half the executives in the building. Bob Atkinson sat near the windows, looking mildly confused about why he was awake this early. Nobody laughed much this time. The mood was too heavy now. Victor cleared his throat. Let's begin. Elaine straightened slightly in her chair. Even then, part of me admired her composure. I can admit that honestly now. She knew the walls were closing in, but she still walked into the room upright. Victor nodded toward company counsel. We are here to review concerns regarding the Rhinemark proposal-related authorization procedures and associated conduct. Associated conduct. Corporate language is funny sometimes. That phrase covered fraud, deception, and sleeping with a business partner in a hotel room after midnight. Elaine folded her hands calmly. I understand. Victor looked toward Daniel. Mr. Price. Daniel opened his folder. We've prepared a timeline based on documentation, witness statements, digital access logs, and communications relevant to the board's review. The room became very still. Daniel wasn't dramatic when he spoke. That's what made him effective. No raised voice. No performance. Just facts laid down one after another like bricks. Friday evening he began. Mrs. Mercer attended dinner with Mr. Reinhardt and her husband at Jeff Ruby's steakhouse in Cincinnati. Elaine's jaw tightened slightly. At approximately 1 o'clock Saturday morning, Mrs. Mercer and Mr. Reinhardt were observed meeting privately at the Phelps Hotel. No one looked at me directly, which I appreciated. Humiliation is easier when people pretend not to notice it. Daniel continued. At 1:05 a.m., photographic evidence placing both parties at the location was transmitted to counsel. Victor glanced at the printed copy in front of him. Then came the financial documents, the access logs, the authorization files tied to Margaret's digital signature, the proposed transfer connected to Rhinemark Holdings. Piece by piece, the room stopped being about infidelity and became about liability. That mattered, because affairs embarrass companies. Forgery threatens them. Elaine finally spoke. My husband was emotional, she said carefully. And emotional people can misunderstand ordinary business interactions. I watched Daniel remain perfectly still beside me. Victor answered before anyone else could. The hotel is your private matter, Elaine. The signature authorization is ours. That line shifted the room completely. No moral outrage, no gossip, just consequences. Margaret finally removed her glasses and looked directly at her daughter. I gave you responsibility, she said quietly, not permission. Elaine's composure cracked for the first time. You never trusted me enough to lead alone. Margaret didn't blink. I taught you how to win, Elaine. Silence. Then, I never taught you how to cheat. That landed harder than shouting would have. Elaine looked away. For a second, she seemed less like a powerful executive and more like a tired little girl still trying to beat her mother at a game nobody else fully understood. Then anger came back. You controlled everything after Dad died, she snapped. Every decision, every approval. Margaret's voice stayed calm. Because every time I stepped back, you looked for shortcuts. Nobody moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Elaine laughed bitterly. Klaus believed in me. Margaret's face changed then, not angry. Sad. No, sweetheart, she said quietly. Klaus believed you were useful. That was the moment Elaine broke. Not loudly. No tears crashing down, no screaming. Just something behind her eyes giving way all at once. Because deep down she already knew it was true. Klaus Reinhardt wasn't waiting outside ready to save her. He wasn't calling. He wasn't defending her to the board. Men like Klaus don't stay when investigations begin. They disappear. Victor folded his hands. The board is suspending your executive authority effective immediately. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. Your account access has already been restricted. An independent review will begin today regarding all authorization procedures tied to the Rhinemark proposal. Company counsel added calmly, external legal review of the signature issue has also been initiated. Marcy looked down at the table. I think she was trying not to cry from relief. Bob Atkinson sighed heavily and muttered, hell of a week. That almost made me smile again. Almost. Elaine stood slowly. So that's it, she asked. Victor answered honestly. That depends on what the investigation finds. No one threatened prison. No one pounded fists. Real consequences are quieter than television. They arrive through paperwork, frozen accounts, and people refusing to protect you anymore. Elaine gathered her things carefully. Her hands shook only once very slightly while closing her laptop. Then she looked at me. Not at the board. At me. Like after everything else, I was somehow still the person whose opinion mattered most. Frank, she said softly, was this worth it? The room stayed silent. I thought carefully before answering. Because despite everything, I didn't want revenge to turn me into a liar, too. No, I said honestly, none of this was worth what it cost. Her eyes filled slightly. Then I continued. But letting it continue would have cost more. Elaine swallowed hard. For a second, I thought she might finally apologize. Instead, she whispered, "I was lonely." That hurt worse than I expected. Not because it excused anything, because part of me understood it. Marriage can become two people slowly disappearing beside each other while pretending routine is intimacy. I nodded once. "So was I said quietly. Then I looked at her wedding ring. I just didn't turn it into a weapon. Elaine stared at me another moment before leaving the room. The door closed softly behind her. And just like that, 25 years ended without shouting. The meeting wrapped up another 20 minutes later. Legal reviews, interim leadership, corporate procedures, adult things, necessary things. But emotionally, it was already over. Outside the boardroom, I stood near the windows, looking down at the wet parking lot below. Daniel came beside me. "You okay?" "No," I admitted. He nodded. "Good. Means you're still human." A week later, Elaine moved into a condo across the river in Kentucky, while attorneys worked through the separation process. I didn't try to destroy her financially. I didn't take pleasure in watching her fall apart. Honestly, by then, I mostly felt tired. Margaret invited me to lunch about a month later at a little diner near Blue Ash. We ate quietly for a while before she finally said, "I misjudged you." I stirred my coffee. "You weren't the only one." A few weeks after that, Victor called and offered me a small consulting position, helping Mercer Blaine reorganize warehouse logistics during the restructuring. Nothing glamorous. Part-time. Mostly operational cleanup and supplier coordination. But it was honest work. Work I actually understood. For the first time in years, nobody in that company looked at me like I was just somebody's husband. 6 months later, I still lived in the house while the divorce finalized. The silence there changed over time. At first it felt empty, then peaceful. One Saturday morning, I walked through Alt Park, carrying a paper coffee cup, while cold Ohio wind moved through the trees. A woman around my age smiled politely when her dog pulled toward me. I smiled back. Nothing dramatic. No instant romance. Just a reminder that life hadn't ended, because my marriage had. That mattered more than I expected. Looking back now, the most painful part wasn't hearing my wife plan a midnight meeting in German. It was realizing she had spent years believing I was too small to notice who she'd become. Maybe that's why this story still stays with me. Sometimes the people who are underestimated the longest are the ones still standing after everybody else collapses. And sometimes dignity doesn't come from winning. Sometimes it comes from finally refusing to disappear. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you loved, then you probably understand how quiet that kind of pain can be. Thanks for listening to my story. And if it stayed with you a while, maybe leave a comment. I really do read them.